this is Nick Merrill from Phreeli, and you're listening to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Firewalls Don't Stop Dragons. I am your host, Kerry Parker, and today we have episode 470 for March 2nd, 2026. Got a really cool interview for you today. We're going to be talking with Nicholas Merrill, Nick, as he prefers to be called, and we are going to be talking about his new company called Phreeli, Phreeli, and it is a new kind of cellular carrier. Technically, it's what we call an MVNO, or a mobile virtual network operator, which I will come back to in a little bit. But he's doing his own thing, and he really wants to create a privacy-focused cellular provider, which kind of seems like a contradiction in terms. And trust me, we're going to get into that. I have lots of questions. So I may have mentioned this before, but just for reference, this is really up my alley because I've probably mentioned before that I'm an electrical engineer by degree. I've got a master's from Purdue, and I'm a software engineer by profession. I went straight into software and never looked back, and I really enjoyed it. And of course, I've since retired from the day job to do this. But what I may not have said, or I don't know how often I've said, is my entire career basically has been focused on some form of telecommunications. And I started my career working on cellular, in particular North American Cellular, or AMPS systems, as they were called back in the day, when that was a thing, and then moved on to GSM Cellular, which eventually, of course, took over the planet in terms of cellular standards. So the first two jobs I ever had for the first 6 or 7 years of my career were directly in cellular communication. So I know what underpins a lot of what we're going to talk about today. And we are going to get a little bit technical. There's a lot of terms, which I'll get to in a minute. But I just wanted to say, I was really kind of geeking out on this because I had a lot of questions based on things that I remember from the networks back then that, unfortunately, a lot of them fundamentally haven't changed a whole lot. But I certainly understood how cellular networks worked, and so I had so many questions about how he was going to make it private. So we're going to get into that. It's very interesting. Can't wait for you to hear it. And part of that is going to be talking about Phreeli's interesting isolation mechanism that they call double-blind Armadillo. Now, it's a funny name, but it's really interesting technology, and I wanted to call out that it uses zero-knowledge proofs, which is something I explained just 5 episodes ago and wrote a blog article about. So now we're actually going to get a look at a real-life use of this privacy-enhancing technology. And so that is really cool. That was well-timed, I think, and maybe not totally coincidental. And then we're also going to just talk about the various ways that we might do things differently in order to know as little as possible about somebody. Something we don't do often enough, probably because there's not a lot of legal restrictions on doing so today, at least in the US, certainly. And the financial incentives for doing it are so lucrative that it's impossible for a lot of companies, especially public companies today, to ignore. But if you take nothing else away from this interview, think about how we could just be doing things differently if we just tried to build in privacy by design, because we just haven't done that really to date. Okay, so I want to get to this interview. Before we do, there's a lot of lingo. Man, there's so much jargon in telecommunications. When I worked in that field, I think it may be second only to the military. Lots of acronyms, lots of weird terms. So we throw out a few of them. Let me just talk about them here. We talk about LECs, LECs. That's a local exchange carrier. And there's the CLEC or the ILEC. The ILEC is the incumbent. The CLEC is the competitive one. So this has to do with some laws where we had monopolies in the phone industry, this country, for a long time until we broke up the baby bells. But then there was other monopolies later, and so eventually, and fiber and other things too, because some big company had to come along with deep pockets and lay all this fiber or put out all these things on the telephone poles or put up all the towers for cell phones. That costs a lot of money, and there's a lot of licenses and all sorts of other things involved in that physical infrastructure. And so once they did that, they kind of owned everything, and no one could compete with that because they couldn't put up a secondary system on top of that because it was just too expensive. So the government basically came along and said, okay, the incumbent, the person who did all that, thank you for doing that, but we need competition. So you're going to have to lease your hardware, your network to a competitor so that they can offer competitive products using your plant. You can guess how that went over with the incumbents, but this is why we have antitrust and why we have the government to step in, and it worked out better for consumers. Anyway, so that's a CLEC and ILEC situation, and that's kind of, I said I would get back to this, that's kind of like the notion of an MVNO. There's the original cell provider, like in the US, we're down to 3 big ones, T-Mobile, AT&T, and Verizon. But there's a lot of other ones, and you may be wondering, do they have their own networks as well? No, they don't. They use one of those 3 networks. And so an MVNO is kind of like a CLEC on, working with an ILEC. And that is exactly what Phreeli is. And we're going to get into that more in the interview. So we're going to talk about CALEA. I've mentioned this recently, but I'll say it again. This is the kind of federal wiretapping law that says you must give law enforcement agencies the ability to listen in on live phone calls. And that stands for the Communications Assistance for Law Enforcement Act. We talk about DSL and T1. Those are just, different kinds of connection mechanisms for data. There's GSM and GSM-A. GSM, of course, is the global system for mobile communications, and the A part is just the association that goes with that. The ITU is the International Telecommunications Union. We talk about BBS, which is bulletin board systems and blue boxes. Those are the freaking boxes that were used to make the special tones that let you get free long-distance calls that Steve Jobs was famous for, and Steve Wozniak back in the day, among others. And then finally, we talk about call records. The formal name for that is a CDR, or call detail record. This is all the metadata that's collected by the phone system for the phone call you made, and so they could bill you properly. And by the way, a lot of this know your customer stuff all comes down to billing. That's going to be a key thing that we're going to learn today. But this has like the calling number, the call ed number, who called whom, call time, call duration, who was billed for that call back when that used to matter. Did the call connect, or did it go to voicemail, or did it just ring forever, or things like that. And then some other kind of internal system stuff that we don't really care about. But all that metadata was really important, and that metadata was made available to law enforcement as well. And it could tell an awful lot about you even without the content of the call. Okay, so I think that covers all the jargon we go through. This is a really interesting interview, so let's get right to it. This is my talk with Nick Merrill from Phreeli. With over 30 years of experience in the technology and privacy sectors, Nick is the founder of Phreeli, a wireless service that wants to know as little as possible about you. As the founder of the Calyx OS and former director of the Calyx Institute, he has dedicated 15 years to developing a privacy-focused Android operating system and championing civil liberties in the digital space. I'm really looking forward to talking about this. Welcome to the show, Nick.
Hey, thanks so much. I really appreciate you inviting me on today.
Modern cell phones are supercomputers with multiple sensors and multiple radio interfaces, and I like to joke that even Orwell didn't envision a portable mass surveillance machine with these sorts of capabilities. I mean, in the book, right, it was the thing on the wall that he could kind of hide from, but we carry these things willingly everywhere. And we've talked a lot on the show about how apps and ad networks and real-time bidding, all that stuff can track you, but we don't talk as much about maybe the tracking potential of the cellular network itself. And I honestly think it's probably because it's kind of inherent in the design, which we're going to talk about today, and therefore it seems kind of unavoidable, but I think we're going to challenge that assumption today. So let's start off by, why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background, particularly as it relates to privacy and digital rights, and then how did that turn into starting Phreeli, and how did those experiences inform the design of the system?
Sure thing. All right. So my background, I always say I identify as a systems administrator. I'm definitely a technologist. I've come from sort of the world of internet service providers originally when I was young. I started one of the first ISPs in New York City around 1994, 1995, when everything was dial-up.
Yeah.
So I go back a ways before the dot-com era. I ran that company for about 10 years. I got involved in a legal challenge post 9/11 about essentially mass surveillance. And essentially the central issue was doing surveillance without obtaining warrants under the Fourth Amendment. And I pursued that for about 10 years as well. And then there was some overlap at the latter half of that, where I started this nonprofit organization called the Calyx Institute, which the intention behind it was to build best practices and software-based building blocks, free software building blocks that service providers and people building apps could use to sort of incorporate privacy by design into their
Yeah.
service offerings. And, I did a lot of work with organizations that have people at risk, with journalist protection organizations and some reporters doing sensitive work. And, I learned a lot about like different threat models and different ways to do privacy and different actually aspects of UX and UI that can cause people to not use the tools if they're not
Right.
easy enough to use. So
That's crucial.
yeah, very. So that's a little bit of my background. And, after leaving Calix Institute this past summer, I went on to launch a phone company, a new mobile phone carrier called Phreeli. And our goal, our simplest to explain goal is we're trying to be more private than the big phone companies. But the intention is to really overpromise on that. I mean, over-deliver on that by a
Right.
lot.
Who is Phreeli meant for? Who's the target audience for Phreeli? And then, conversely, is there somebody that maybe it's not meant for? And please explain to my audience. I know what this is because I've been in the industry, but what is an MVNO?
Let's start there. An MVNO is a mobile carrier that doesn't own all of the cell phone towers and radio frequencies. Those two things are the most expensive parts of being a mobile provider because, the United States is a big country. You have to put up a lot of towers. You have to run fiber optic cable between the towers to connect them. You have to have all this internet bandwidth. And then most expensively of all, you have to have licenses to use the radio spectrum to transfer, the call data. So a lot of companies, when they want to go into the mobile provider space, it's not economically feasible for a startup to build a network like that exists, from the big three carriers.
Right.
You would need trillions of dollars. So it's a whole spectrum of different types of existence, the term MVNO, because essentially it means that you're running the phone company, but you don't control the towers and the radio frequencies. And that could range from owning your own core network. You could have other alternate radio setups that are above and beyond like the 4G, 5G spectrum. That's been a thing that people have tried. And it could range all the way down to like, it's really just marketing and billing being done by a company and everything else is done by the carrier. And, we're somewhere in the middle where we rely completely on the radio network of a big carrier, who I'm not supposed to name, by the way.
Okay.
But we are controlling all the user information. We are the ones that know or don't know, as the case may be, information about who the clients are or what they're doing, et cetera. And, it's an interesting adventure. It has been an interesting adventure for me.
I'll bet.
Also on a technical level, but also on a legal level, and exploring all the different rules and regulations that govern phone companies. I did work at a phone company briefly for about a year in around 2005, and I was the IT director there, but I didn't have to come into contact so much with all the legal regs and obligations. And this experience has really opened my eyes to just how regulated this industry is. It's mind-boggling.
Was this a product of the fact that back in the old days, long distance was held by, one or two companies, monopolies, and the government basically stepped in and said, you have to lease this to other people and let other people compete with you over your own infrastructure. Right. Is this a product of that same kind of a deregulation or whatever you want to call it?
Oh, you're talking about like the breakup of AT&T into the baby bells and all that, or?
And MCI and some of the other with the long distance. Yeah. I don't know, to be honest, whether the MVNO thing was due to FCC force, like kind of how when the CLEC thing happened, at least where I was from in New York City, it forced the incumbent, which was New York Telephone at the time, to open up their copper infrastructure to these alternate providers, and that they could put equipment in the COs in the central offices. They could put DSL equipment in there or whatever, or T1 equipment, whatever, and run using their infrastructure. I don't know whether MVNOs exist under that same kind of understanding. I have the feeling that probably not. I feel like a lot of these rules haven't necessarily been updated. Sometimes they miss things, like
they like fiber isn't regulated in the same way that other forms of internet access used to be. They never really sort of caught up. But yeah, I don't. I wish I had a better answer for that one. That's an interesting question.
Okay, so as someone who might be thinking, sure, this sounds great. I'd like to try this. Who is this for? Who was your target audience? What was the demographic you were looking for? What problem were you trying to solve? And is there anybody that doesn't fall under that umbrella?
I would say that the vast majority of people are potential customers. I'm talking like just regular people that don't have a crazy threat model, people that just want their privacy back, people that would rather choose a company that protected them and was looking out for their interests rather than a company that was exploiting their data to make more money. I think if I was to say like who would not be our customer, it would probably be someone like, I'm just going to pick Ed Snowden out of a random thing. Well, some people are like, oh wow, does this stop the KGB and the NSA from watching me? And it's like, no, like there's so many things in the world out there that are spying on us, right? I mean, we all know this. There's Bluetooth tracking in stores. There's license plate readers. There's satellites. There's God knows what there is. There's drones everywhere. This is trying to deal with one particular aspect of privacy, which is essentially all of your online data being attached to your name and then being packaged up as a packet of data that's being sold to data brokers. And there are many other ways that your personal data can leak through your phone. Like if you get really sketchy apps that then sell that data to data brokers. So this doesn't plug all of those holes. This is trying to deal with this one, which is mobile providers that exploit the data of the customers.
And we cannot sell that short because the telecom providers, particularly the mobile providers, now that everything has pretty much gone mobile, have gotten really bad at this. I mean, I remember back when Verizon was quote unquote caught tagging all of your internet traffic with their ID, and then they would turn around and sell it to other people, and how that everyone got so worked up about that. And they said, oh no, our bad, we're going to stop doing that. And then later the administration's like, no, go ahead. And so now they do. And they probably all do this. And there's so much information that they have. Your location data in particular is so juicy for learning about you and your whereabouts and what you do and who you hang out with. And a lot of these companies now have zero regulations on being able to sell that on to other people.
Absolutely. And there's been such crazy scandals too, where I've seen things where people that were doing classified work for the government, they were overseas, and then they would do jogs around some lake or something like that, and then and they were using Strava or some app like that, and then all this information got leaked, and they were like, look, now we can see where this person is, where they work, where they run, where they live, blah 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 blah. And it's I sort of get why people like big data. Like if I use Google Maps and it tells me to get off the highway to avoid some slowdown, and it saves me like a half hour of sitting in bumper to bumper traffic, then I appreciate big data at that time. But it's just sort of like the over accumulation of that data that's sort of the problem. I mean, I guess what I mean to say is I'm a big supporter of like an a la carte menu, and I can see how you don't want to give up all of the advantages of big data. Like for instance, that traffic one is a great example. But I don't know. I have a lot of friends who became sort of privacy absolutists. So they wouldn't have a SIM card. They would only use Wi-Fi like in McDonald's or something, and were changing the MAC address of their Wi-Fi every time and all that. And it's all well and good, but the problem is that most people don't want to inconvenience their lives to that level.
Right.
So it's like you have to meet people where they are.
Well, you got to participate in society today, and it's almost impossible not to have a cell phone. Now, maybe you have a dumb phone, but I think that the crucial point, a lot of that stuff is, I like big data too. I'm an engineer. I love data. But it doesn't have to be personalized data. It doesn't have to be tied to your identity. Sure. We could get all those traffic benefits without necessarily knowing who all those individual cars are that are stuck in that traffic.
It's true.
And so in your white paper, you make a point to say, and I thought this was really interesting, is that cell phone carriers don't need to know the identity of their customers to provide the service. From a technical standpoint, if I just have to deliver calls to your device, I technically don't need to know who you are. But where that comes in, of course, is billing. That's the byproduct of billing, that they need to kind of know who you are. Right. So you set up Phreeli specifically to address this, and I really want to dig into this. And if you wanted to, you could sign up for an account with nothing but what you say is a zip+4 code.
Yes.
And so first of all, why zip+4, not just regular zip? But without anything else, how does that work? Like, walk me through the account setup process for a Phreeli account. And, you could do like quote unquote regular, but then like, what's the minimum?
Sure. Sure. So one of the ways that we've been looking at our sign up process is sort of like, I don't know if you remember the books that were called Choose Your Own Adventure. They were like a kid's book, and then it involved the kid reading. It's like a 40-page book, but each path through the book, there were like alternate paths you could take depending on decisions you would make along the way. You would end up reading like 5 pages. So
like a choose your own ending kind of a thing.
Exactly. Like, do you want to turn left at the fork or right at the fork? And so I've been saying that our sign up process is sort of like a choose your own adventure type of a thing, because you can give slightly more bits of information if you want convenience. So if you give a phone number or if you give an email address, then it makes it easier for us to notify you. But in the most minimal way to sign up for Phreeli, you can give as little as just a zip+4. So that involves using an eSIM as opposed to a physical SIM. If we have to mail you a physical SIM, then we have to have someplace to mail it. But so if you choose eSIM, you get electronic delivery right off of the website. You can just scan it into your phone right there. Why zip+4 and not regular zip? Basically, advice that we've gotten on taxation. One zip code can actually
always comes back to taxes.
Yeah, one zip code can apparently cover multiple tax jurisdictions.
Sure.
And so we wanted to make absolutely sure that we're paying enough taxes and all the taxes that we need to pay, and just never have to worry about that. Just know that we're doing it as accurately and fully as possible. And so that's, based on advice we got, that if we just did a zip code alone, we might find ourselves, having someone say, hey, prove to us that that person was in this tax jurisdiction, not the other one. And if we don't have information on who the people are and where they live, we might find ourselves in an awkward place. So we are asking them to tell us precisely which tax jurisdiction that we're paying to.
So to be perfectly clear, when I'm saying you only need a zip+4, I don't mean like that's the part of the address. I mean, that's all you need. Like, there's no name. You could do it without an email address, you said.
Correct.
The only thing you have to have for taxation purposes is a zip+4, period.
Correct.
Now, I'm curious, I don't know if you know this, how tight a geographic area is a zip+4? How many people might that contain?
I think that largely depends. Because, the United States is so varied geographically. Right. I mean, if you go out to like County Road 20 in like West Texas or something, a zip+4, I don't know, might be a huge area. It might be like 100-mile area or something. And then maybe in a city, I grew up in New York City. Maybe in some cities, zip+4 might be like a 40-unit apartment building or something like that. It really depends. I mean, I don't know how precise that is, but it's definitely not, like, in most cases, I don't think it ever refers to like a house. It'll be like a 10-block area in a suburb or something like that.
Yeah.
Which, again, going back to our original value proposition, is that we're more private than the big phone companies. Not that Ed Snowden can, hide from the NSA with this. I always want to go back to that, because I feel like people sometimes try to say, but it doesn't protect you from the satellite tracking. And I'm like, yes, no, I know that. Anyway, so yeah, I think it's certainly an improvement over having, your full information, your social security number, your driver's license number, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And I mean, if we could, it should be clear, I guess, through the explanation of why we do it this way, that like, if we could get away with not asking for anything, we would do that. But we also want to make our company sustainable, and we want to make sure that we comply with all the rules and do everything right. So that was sort of a compromise decision that we made in the interest of, just being prudent.
Obviously, with almost all the big carriers, they ask for all sorts of information, but there are some other odd cases that I've read about, and I actually tried this once just to see what it was like. And like, I can get a Mint Mobile starter pack by going into a Target and buying with cash and walking out the door without any other information. How does it compare in your mind to that kind of a thing?
I mean, it may not be that different, but the direction that we're going in terms of using the cryptography to separate the identity from the payment method and on the other side, the phone calls and all the metadata, does still come into play. Like if you go buy the Mint Mobile SIM with cash, how are you gonna pay for it like on an ongoing basis?
Hmm.
Most likely you're going to want to go on their website and use your credit card, right? That would be the easiest thing to just hang out at
Hmm.
home, put it on auto pay, whatever. The way that a lot of people use their utilities, especially I think ones that are lower in price, like I'm not talking like your heating bill, which could be huge or small, but like a phone bill, it's always like $50 every month or whatever. People put it on auto pay. So I feel like, yeah, there are ways that you could get things. And so at that point, if you use your credit card on auto pay with Mint Mobile, now they know that it's you, right?
Right.
That'll be saved with your account. So it's sort of like right away, right out of the gate, you're gonna have to do a lot more work. Like, do you want to go get some Visa gift cards and pay for it with those, like these Visa, MasterCard gift cards? You can do that. What if you want to use cryptocurrency? Generally, the providers don't accept it. We make a point of accepting all the forms of cryptocurrency that we can, including some of the major privacy-focused ones like Monero and Zcash. So essentially, I think kind of what you're getting at is like, yes, it's possible to sort of hobble together parts of what we've done on your own, but I think it involves a lot less convenience.
Hmm.
Like we're trying to go right as far as we can, right up to the exact same level of convenience you would have with a regular major carrier. We're trying to approach that because that's one thing that I've noticed is that people, and this comes from reading a lot of opinion polls.
Hmm.
There's really interesting polling from the Pew Agency out there about privacy and telecom. And essentially, it's like people really, really want more privacy. They understand on both sides of the aisle and all age brackets that like their data is being exploited by big data and it's sort of like everything is spun out of control and they don't feel like there's anything that they could do about it. But they also don't like their telecommunications providers now, and they're willing to leave in a second if there was a better option. And so our goal is to try to make it so that the trade-off, the price that you pay in convenience is almost nothing. One of the things that we had to do if we don't know the identity of our customers is we've had to become basically prepay only, right?
Hmm.
So many people have a relationship with their phone company where it's post pay. So you use data and make phone calls all month, and at the end of the month, depending on what you did, your bill could be more or less. We have a prepay only model, and in that way, we're not extending credit to people, and so therefore we don't need to pull your credit, and we don't, there's all that kind of stuff that it
Right.
eliminates a lot of the financial headaches and subsequently the risks for the company too. So that's a good thing as well. But I would say so maybe that is a slight inconvenience, but there's really no simple way around that while maintaining the same model that we've started with.
Well, and to your point, I think it's a different, like the most fundamental difference is doing that. What I just described earlier and some of the things around that is like trying to work around their systems.
Yeah.
Whereas this is built in. It's the point of your system.
Yeah.
That fundamental difference alone makes it different. All right. I want to get into some technical details because I know that some of my audiences, their ears are perking up like, what? This is possible? Like most people didn't think this kind of thing is possible. So I'm sure they want to more get into some of the details about, find the edges of this. So first of all, SIM jacking is a thing. People take over your account and then all of a sudden they have access to your two-factor codes and whatnot. Given that you know potentially so little about your subscribers, how does that factor in? How do I recover my account if I lose my phone or it's lost or stolen? And then does this actually ironically somehow help prevent SIM jacking in some way because so I don't know. How does this factor in with your service?
SIM jacking is like not a huge problem. I think it's a fascinating story because you
It
hear
is.
about like some Bitcoin whale that had all their money
Right.
taken, but I don't think it's really happening en masse to that many people. That said, we're trying to support all types of interesting security. We have 2FA and one-time passwords, and the only way that you can initiate a port is by logging into your account. So we don't actually do port ins and port outs on the phone. Like that all has to be done from the account. So it is something that we're really serious about. It isn't like we're trying to do. I love security. I've been working on security for a long time, and people who know me know that I'm always obsessed with getting everyone to use YubiKeys and Signal and all kinds of some of the easier tools. for doing privacy, and security better. But like there are providers that focus almost completely on the SIM jacking threat, and that's not really our focus. Although, like I said, we are super serious about security, and we enjoy security. We have a really great chief security officer that we work with, who used to be the CSO at Etsy. So some of the people we've brought in are like from, I don't know if that count, that doesn't really count as big tech per se, but
Yeah.
but they were on the NASDAQ, I believe.
All right.
Anyway.
So, okay, as somebody who's come from this background, I know that there's a lot of identifiers associated with any GSM system. And we used to have, GSM wasn't the standard it is today, but now it's everywhere. So it's not just your phone number. You've also got an IMSI and IMEI, and of course your SIM card. So first of all, give the audience a brief understanding of what these IDs are for and how they work and how that might be tied to my identity. And then I'm curious, like you mentioned earlier, MAC addresses for Bluetooth tracking. A lot of phones now rotate MAC addresses as you walk around to prevent exactly what you were talking about. Is that even possible in situations like this? I'm guessing probably not. But okay, so given all that, once we've talked about what these IDs are, the follow-up question is, the reason I'm asking, if I managed to find and identify that, okay, I know the IMEI of this device, and I figured out that that's Carrie Parker's IMEI, is it toast? Game over?
It depends a lot on what is the game. You know what I mean? When you say,
Sure.
is that game over? Like, again, this sort of goes back to like, are you the regular person that didn't want their information sold to data brokers, who wanted to protect their kids and their family from being vacuumed up into the behemoth? Or are you Ed Snowden? Like, if you're Ed Snowden, yeah, maybe game's over at that point. That's why that's a much harder challenge. But yeah, so like you have really the two primary identifiers, and this is like an oversimplification, but in the interest of sort of getting through it in a reasonable amount of time, you do have something called the IMEI, which is a mobile equipment identifier, and that means that it's like the serial number of a phone. And I would sort of make this analogy, like if you think of how to identify a car, the car has a VIN number. And the VIN number, you can see it through the windshield. It's like right in front of the driver by the steering wheel. And it's also imprinted on the frame of the car and on the engine block and all over. Like it's all got the same serial number. But separately on the back of the car, you have a license plate. And that license plate can come off and go on. And you could get a Wyoming license plate or replace it with an Idaho license plate and so on. That one can change. And so if you think about a phone, the VIN number is sort of like the IMEI. It's part of the phone. When it connects to the tower, the first thing it sends is the IMEI number. Each phone, when it communicates with the tower has to be able to keep them separate to understand which one it wants to send a message to. So it has to have some unique identifier. That IMEI number in basically all phones is static. It's burned into some type of like a one-time fuse thing in the hardware, and you can't change it. Now, the SIM card has this other number called an IMSI, and that is a mobile subscriber ID. And that one has to do with your phone account and whether you're authorized to make phone calls or use data or send SMSs. There are some exceptions to that. Like you can connect to a cell tower without a SIM card, without an IMSI at all, and call 911. With any phone that doesn't have a SIM card. But if you want to make any kind of a call that would cost money, then you have to have a SIM card and you have to be paid up. And the IMSI is the number through which someone checks with your cell phone provider to see that your bill's paid and you're, in good standing. Now, is changing them interesting? Yeah, I mean, it is interesting, and it's something that you can do. Potentially, it sort of depends on which cell provider you're working with and what their policies are, what they'll allow on their network. Because if someone tried to do an implementation like that, it could easily, I could see go haywire and break something. It's not, cell providers are very big on certifying new devices that they allow on their network. And they don't, I don't think that they necessarily appreciate like large scale deployments of more or less experimental stuff doing weird things on their network because they value, stability.
Sure.
So yes, like it is theoretically possible to change these numbers, and then that could, in theory, really, make it, I think, much more hard to track someone using. There's these devices that are out there that are colloquially called stingrays. I think that's a
Yep.
brand name, or MC catchers.
Yep.
And they are being used in some places. Like I'm sure that if you go around the United Nations or you go into the center part of DC, you might see those
Yep.
things in use. But it is super interesting. But I think one question is, like, let's say your cell provider would send you new IMSIs all the time. Let's say every hour your phone changed IMSIs, but the IMEI in the phone is the same because it's burned into the phone. So you have an
Hmm.
iPhone, you can't change to IMEI. You have a Google Pixel or a Samsung, they don't let you change the IMEI. It might be possible to get a phone that lets you change the IMEI. I mean, that there have been in the past, but then, like, I think most people that are into phone security would acknowledge that, like, some of the most secure phones available right now are Google Pixel phones, like the newest ones, and the latest iPhones. Those two companies really seem to have the tightest
Yeah.
security out of all of them. And so if you want a phone that's going to let you change the IMEI, it's not going to be those. So now you're going to have probably a much more insecure phone.
Mm.
And so it's like, is that worth it to me? Like, I think I would
Right.
rather have a more secure phone.
Sure.
You know what I mean? That like, to me, having the latest security updates and kernel patches on the phone is
Right. Oh,
is
yeah.
is a bigger part of my threat model than they're tracking my IMEI.
The problem is, of course, that it's really at the lowest level. It's baked into the GSM standard. So all these phones that want to work on a GSM system have to comply with the GSM protocols. And a lot of these protocols assume that these numbers are fixed. We almost need to do what we're starting to do with financial stuff now with credit cards and what Apple's done with like Apple Pay, where we need a tokenization system where you're not giving up those IDs all the time. You're giving up a token that represents that ID, and that token can change all the time. And so therefore those tokens aren't trackable because we're exchanging ephemeral things that are related, and it gets things by. But that would have to be baked into the standard. That is something you probably couldn't just do on your own.
No, not on our end, but there are organizations that you can participate in, like the GSMA, that come up with the
Right.
standards. And so one of the interesting things about becoming a carrier is qualifying for membership in organizations like that, and then theoretically being able to play a
Oh,
role
yeah.
in the process.
Get a seat at the table.
Exactly.
I know some countries actually require basically KYC, know your customer. You can't get a SIM card without tying it to your identity. That hasn't happened in the US yet. But are you worried about this happening? And then if that does, how does that affect what you're trying to do?
When you say in a few countries, I think that's an understatement. I think it's many, possibly most countries. I don't know. I don't have an exact number. I don't know if most is overstepping, but it feels that
It's
way to
dozens.
me.
It's at least dozens. And
For sure.
big name countries. Yeah. It's yes.
For sure. It's totally. I think that's unreasonable, but I think this makes me always to think of the analogy of like when I was a kid, that there were payphones on every corner, and you could, I'm so old that when I was a kid, payphones cost a dime.
Right.
So you would go up to the payphone, you drop a dime in, and you can make a call, and you didn't have to show ID, and the phone wasn't under 24-hour surveillance, and that was okay. And so in a way, that's sort of my expectation for usage of the phone system. I feel like it was never an authenticated thing, and it probably shouldn't be today. It's such a standard thing that you sort of, people do their medical stuff on the phone, they do their benefits stuff on the phone, they do their retirement, their banking, their all their personal most communications. Like it's so essential now that I feel like it's almost approaching being like a human right.
Yeah. So given that, you plan to try to offer this internationally? What's your thought?
It's something that I've thought about for sure. Going back to the whole approach to taxation, it's like the rules exist. You want to do business in a country, there are rules that apply to companies in that country. And there may be special rules for telcos that don't apply to, I don't know, flower shops or whatever.
Yes.
And so that's sort of the lay of the land. So an interesting question is to say, okay, we have a system that through zero knowledge proofs and mixed service and various cryptographic privacy technologies, we've created a delinking between the identity of a customer and the metadata. What happens if you go to a country that requires actual IDing of each customer. What happens if you still apply this business model that we've built to that situation? Like, what are the people getting an advantage over the status quo? And so, in some respects, I think that the answer is yes. The other thing, though, is that let's say, just take the European Union, for example, there are data retention directives there that we don't have in the US. They actually require retaining different types of data from service providers for like 18 months or some period of time. It's all different, slightly different regs from country to country. But the overall directive is, I think, a European Union directive. So that further complicates things. But like, okay, so let's say you're forced to retain some metadata and you're forced to retain some information about the customers, but you still can't link them. Then what? I think it opens up interesting questions. It would potentially create like a weird legal limbo, like a gray area. But it's certainly worth exploring. If you want to do business in a certain country, like in the EU, you're going to have to accept like the lay of the land and the laws as they are, and then see what can you do given that. So there's no immediate plan to do so, but I'm open to having discussions.
Okay, so you've gone to great lengths to separate some of these bits of data from each other, and you call it unlinkability. Tell us a little about this thing you call double-blind armadillo, and at a high level, how this works, and the design that you put into this that allows you to collect as little as you do.
So double-blind armadillo is a trade name, and it comes from the fact that the mascot for Phreeli is a little cartoon armadillo whose name is Phreeli. And so Phreeli, the armadillo, he sometimes appears as a ball rolled up, like armored, as armadillos do when they're protecting themselves, or sometimes he unrolls and exposes his belly and is happy because Phreeli has agency and he's excited about his ability to decide when to be closed and when to be open. And that's supposed to tell people how they're going to feel if Phreeli is their phone provider. So based on that name, Phreeli the armadillo, we were looking for a name. We were trying to understand like how are we going to explain this technology to a wide audience?
Yes.
And we thought to riff on this armadillo theme and call it double-blind armadillo. And it's sort of inspired by double-blind studies that they do in science for like pharmaceutical research or whatever.
Right.
And also it's essentially talking about the underlying technology is something called zero knowledge proofs. It's really two things. Zero knowledge proofs is one technology in which someone that has information can prove to another person or entity that they possess this information, but without showing the information.
Actually, we recently talked about this in the podcast. Yeah.
Is that so? Oh, interesting.
Yes.
So, it comes from academia. It comes from cryptography research going back a couple of decades, but only kind of recently in the last 10 years or so, have there been some like interesting practical implementations of it in like software libraries and stuff like that. And we decided to try to use this technology to have essentially a system in between the identity side that has the payments and the side that has the phone control and the internet access and phone dialing, be able to communicate with each other, but without linking the two together. So using zero knowledge proofs, the side with the identity and the payments can tell the phone side, this phone is paid up for this month. It's February now. They sent in their payment. They're good till the end of February. And so alternately, using zero knowledge proofs, the phone side can tell the user side, this person has used up their entire 10 gigabytes of mobile data and needs to top up or change plan levels. So it enables intercommunication, but without being able to link them together. And then we also have something called a mix service. And if you're familiar with Tor, it's sort of related to that. It's not the same. It's a sort of a poor analogy, but mix services. Or like, do you remember when there was all those Nix email servers? So that was a whole thing back in the day too. This is going way back to like the 90s.
No, I actually don't remember mixed email service.
Yeah, there was this one called Anon Penet Merrill.fi.
Huh.
It was a famous Merrill server, a mix server. And anyway, the idea of a mix server is that you queue a whole bunch of requests and then you run them all at one time. So if an observer is observing a phone company, and let's say there's 1,000 customers, and you're one of the customers, and they observe you go to the website and do something that looks like submitting a payment. And then immediately afterwards, they see a request go out to add more data to some phone number. That would be a way to connect one action to the other reaction. And so what we do is we have a mix service in the middle where everything gets queued up and then run once a day. So we have like 500 actions that run at a certain time. And that way, there's not a simple way to make a timing correlation between an action and a reaction.
This reminds me of crypto mixing services, and the best explanation for that, and it's a slightly different thing you're trying to obfuscate, but with the crypto ones, it's the best way I've ever heard it described is you get a hat. Everybody puts $20 in the hat and you pull $20 out.
Yeah.
You don't know which $20 that is. You don't care which $20 that is because it's still $20.
Right.
But if every one of our bills do have serial numbers on them, and if you wanted to stop some tracking, it's a similar concept, even though it's solving a different problem.
Yeah. I mean, and this reminds me too of like that discussion we had earlier about taxation. There was a whole bunch of research that went into this other aspect of taxation, which is that maybe you do know this. I don't know. I feel like most people don't know this, but there are mobile taxes at the federal level, the state level, and the county level. So if you're in like Nassau County, New York, it's different than if you're just 1 mile east and you're in Suffolk County, New York. And so one of the things that's interesting as far as like fingerprinting users is that if you add the taxes onto the price, let's say your mobile bill is $35 every month, and then you add the federal, the state, and the county on top, it will tend to make different people in different tax jurisdictions more identifiable. So what we did was we included all the taxes and fees into the price. So it's always a flat rate price. So everyone's always paying $35 exactly. And then we're paying the taxes out of that.
Interesting.
So
that's cool.
Yeah. So, I mean, a lot of thought has gone into like literally every level of how this works and what are the different ways that information can leak out and what can we do to sort of to regularize all the traffic so that it all looks the same as much as we can.
I've got a few very technical questions I want, and we could just kind of do this a little bit as a lightning round because I know that this goes back to some of the things like you're not trying to protect Edward Snowden, but I would also like to bring these up because from my experience, I know that these are some other ways in which our telecom system can expose us in ways that I don't think a lot of people are aware of. So I'd like to just bring these up and just kind of get a quick take from you on whether or not these things are accounted for and what they might mean to somebody. First of all, just in order for a cell phone to function, the cell phone provider or the system that they run has to know where your phone is, at least to the point that they need to know what tower you're being serviced by, because if they have to route a call to you or send a text message to you, that's how that gets done. It's kind of built into how the design of cellular stuff works. So I assume you're probably not hiding the location of the device. What you're doing is making it so that no one knows whose device that belongs to. Did I get that right? And then how does that, you as an MVNO, you do have a host provider, which you're not naming, but do they have a different view on this or any more information than you do?
So we don't actually know what towers people are connected to. We don't have that granular of a view. There are records that we get because they come from upstream that do have more information than what we want, but we discard all the data that we don't have a business purpose to keep. And when I say that, I mean to say that the main way that a person could owe us more money than their standard monthly service fees if they use tons of mobile data. So we have a business purpose to know how many gigabytes of mobile data each person used, because we need to make sure that we get paid for that. Because when you use the data, it runs up a bill like in Phreeli's name, and that we're going to have to pay for one way or another. So all the rest, right? Location, we don't need to know. Who you called, we don't need to know. There's lots of other data that is coming over the cell phone network just because of the nature of what it is, and we don't need it. We don't want it. So we're only keeping exactly what we need. And to the extent that we can ever aggregate or anonymize data, we're doing that as well. There was actually a whole other rabbit hole we could go down, but we're actually looking into right now, and no promises, but we've been talking about a legal structure, which would be a data cooperative, which would be where whatever data there is would be collectively owned by all the customers and the company, or a third party company that we set up. And therefore, there's this concept called the third party doctrine. It comes from Supreme Court precedent. This would sort of, in theory, do an end run around third party doctrine. It would mean that the users actually own their own data. So
I like that.
Yeah, I mean, part of I spent so long doing court stuff with lawyers and constitutional law, and I took constitutional law when I was in college, and I really got a kick out of it. I mean, I also found it very disheartening, but I like to think that we aren't just trying to innovate in terms of technology and cryptography and stuff like that, but also think about legal structures and policies and different. It's like legal hacking, if we call it.
Right.
So yeah, that's something that we think about a lot.
What does your upstream host provider have, and does it maintain that same information? And if so, can they still tie that to you? You being the user.
Yeah. Well, we don't share any information about who our customers are with our upstream, and they don't ask us to, and as we've discussed, we also don't even have that information, even if they did ask us for it. So do they see location? Yeah, of course, because you're connecting to a cell tower. So they see a phone connected to a cell tower. They see an IMSI number from the SIM card that they know is attached to Phreeli. And as you said, like, it's the necessary aspect for them to be able to route calls to your phone is they have to know which towers you're connected to, and that's not going away. Like, this isn't a solution to that. But is it connected to you? No.
All right. There are a lot of other entities and frameworks involved in routing cellular traffic beyond even what we've talked about. For example, most people don't know, because we don't track roaming anymore. Roaming used to be a thing. Now as you kind of alluded to with your traffic, you worry about roaming because you've got agreements with these other people to pay each other for the services that were rendered for your devices on their network. But thank God, we don't have to track as a user roaming. That used to be horrible. I remember that, like, you not want to leave certain areas, or you all of a sudden get charged so much more money because you were using someone else's cell towers. Anyway, but because that all stuff still exists, there's still a visited network, and you're on someone else's system, so they have some amount of information about you. And then there's underlying all of this is all telecom, not just mobile. It's this thing called Signaling System 7. It's been around for decades. It's really not terribly secure. There's all sorts of talk about how it's hacked by foreign intelligence services or whatever. I'm sure what you're going to say is I can't do anything about that, but just what is your take on that, and what does that mean for you as a service and trying to be as private as possible?
Yeah, I mean, this gets into sort of like the earlier discussion of 4G protocol definitions and 5G and all that kind of stuff. Like, it gets into global tech infrastructure, which is developed like in the ITU and all these different international bodies. It's definitely troublesome. Like, all the security stuff that you mentioned is fascinating and interesting. I kind of come from the phone hacking world. It's not something I don't know. I probably haven't talked about it publicly so much, but I got involved in technology at the beginning because of 2600 magazine.
Oh, great. Yeah.
And so I bought it on the newsstand when I was a kid, when I was maybe like 13. And by the time I was 14, I started going to the monthly meetups in Manhattan. I met Emmanuel Goldstein and all the people that were there. Some of them became famous or infamous later. And it was a really interesting time. This was like in the mid 80s, essentially.
So did you ever do any freaking?
Oh, yeah. I mean, everyone was doing that back then. I didn't do like tone generating stuff. I think I was too late for that. I don't think that even worked at that time.
Right.
But I think I built a blue box. It just, I couldn't use it.
Sure. Yeah.
So, I mean, I got into that scene, as sort of at the end of it, but it was during the BBS days. And, I was really into that stuff. I ran a BBS. And that's actually how a bunch of my good friends from today are people that I know from then.
Fantastic.
But so, look, that stuff is fascinating. SS7 security and just the way the entire phone system works. I mean, I've been watching it slowly progress, and I do see improvement sometimes, especially if you look at like the differences between the latest GSM standards, like between 4G and 5G, they added a bunch of really interesting security properties,
Mm,
and there are some people influencing. I have some friends who participate in GSMA and the protocol discussions and have done some really interesting stuff. And sometimes it's about grandfathering the old tech that has all
right.
the big problems in it, like 2G, for instance, as a whole
Hmm.
sort of de-authentication
Yep.
bug in it that you can't go back and fix in all this old equipment.
A lot of the old Stingray technology relied on those vulnerabilities to 2G.
Exactly. So, like, I wish I'm fascinated by that. I like to read about it. I love to have discussions about it with people, but that is definitely well above and beyond the scope of what we're trying to do, at least today. Although, like
Right.
I said, I'm interested in participating in those discussions and trying
Yeah.
to, give some input if that's ever possible.
One more I want to ask about, and that is lawful intercept. And this is something when I worked at telecom, this was a big deal. And this is something that a lot of our features had to work around because it was a legal requirement to do so. CALIA was the law, but it was lawful intercepted. The government basically said, look, if we come with a warrant, you've got to be able to tap people's phones. And that carried on to the mobile world too. So I'm curious, because I've never understood this. What is it like in the cell phone world for this? Who does that? Where are those hooks? I assume it's your upstream provider that would actually be providing that since they own the network. But do you have any requirements? Is it MVNO along those lines? How does that work?
So I think this does go back to an earlier part of the discussion where I was saying that being an MVNO could be a whole different beast depending on what
Right.
parts of the network you're running, which parts of the network you're owning. Are you routing the calls yourself, or are you sending them over the upstream network, et cetera, et cetera? In our case, we're just using the upstream network for calling. So if anyone has to comply with CALIA, that's really them. We
Okay.
don't have the ability to tap into the calls, and if we got a request like that, we wouldn't be able to comply with it. So
Okay.
those things still exist, and those things, though, I think sometimes I've been asked questions that were about CALIA, but they seem to conflate multiple different things that happen sometimes in terms of process,
Mm,
service of process from courts or law enforcement or whatever. CALIA is really focused on real-time interception. So like listening to audio of phone calls and the contents of SMS. There are other forms of service like national security letters that I
mm,
received in 2004, which are much more concerned with metadata and collecting logs, collecting identifiable information, things like that. And so, look, ultimately, I have a whole history of pushback against overly broad, overly burdensome, or potentially unconstitutional requests. And,
yeah.
that's still who I am. But I recognize the fact that you can't just burn the whole thing down over one request necessarily. There comes a time when if everyone in the whole company is going to go to prison, we can't go down that road. But at the same time, and my sort of take on these rules is that I accept that there are reasons why this is necessary sometimes, and although I'm super strongly pro privacy, that doesn't mean that I'm against like law enforcement targeting a serial killer or something like that.
Right.
So if they need to target someone, then they should. The thing that I'm most offended by is dragnet surveillance and warrantless surveillance, mass
Yep.
surveillance of people that aren't suspected of doing anything wrong. And that's really who we want to help. So anyway, this is a long rant about other stuff that doesn't necessarily directly relate to CALIA, but essentially, yeah, we have to, the shortest answer is we have to comply with all the rules that everyone else has to comply with. But I do have like ACLU and EFF lawyers in my speed dial and in my signal.
Good.
Uh, and I'm not afraid to call them. Um, that said, I hope we have smooth sailing. Like we don't want customers who are doing bad things. We don't want to help people doing bad things. We want to help people just being regular people. Uh,
I had the privilege of interviewing Joseph Cox about his wonderful book, Darkwire, and the whole Anam thing, which, was just a fascinating story. If you haven't read the book, you definitely need to. I'm talking about the audience. But, a common complaint within the privacy community, and I'm sure you run into folks like this, is that, okay, well, you prove what you say you're going to do? How do I know that this is not just marketing language? And especially if it's a closed source system or whatever, how do you engender trust? How do you respond to people who are skeptics?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I see this come up sometimes with like VPNs, for instance, and people are like, well, how do I know that the VPN provider isn't just logging and or selling all my data to a data broker,
right,
like the telco that I was trying to avoid?
Exactly, right.
And yeah, in the end, it can be really hard to know. And in the end, you in a lot of cases, you don't really know. There aren't necessarily ways for a regular person to verify that things are happening the way that
Yes.
they've been told. Sometimes there are ways built into technology that would allow like a very skilled person to do some type of authentication or proving. And that's actually something we're looking into doing with double-blind Armadillo. Like we want to make it so that, are you a cryptographer? Like here's a way that you can verify that this is happening the way that we've told you it's happening. That's part of the technology that we haven't rolled out yet. We got to a certain point that is sort of what you call minimal viable product, and tried to launch with that just so we could get going, because before we run out of money, and then we want to go back and iterate and keep improving it. But no, at the end of the day, I think one of the things that, and this isn't an answer to that, but one of the things that I think someone has to do when they're choosing a vendor, whatever the vendor is, whether it's, someone to work on your car, or someone, that's running a daycare to take care of your kids or whatever, there's an aspect of the human level of trust involved. And I have a long track record going back a few decades of basically taking personal risk and making pretty significant, I would say, personal sacrifices to protect the privacy of even just one individual. The whole national security letter lawsuit that I was involved in from 2004 to 2012 or so was all about the privacy of one person and the records of one person. And so, I think that ought to count for something. Like, something about me, like, and what I stand for. I think some of the other companies out there, it's less clear. It's less well defined, I think, what the values of the companies are. And I'm trying to make it clear what the values that Phreeli stands for are.
Yep. All right, one more question before we go. And you've already mentioned that, you talked about this in the white paper as well, that you're slowly rolling out some of these features, like double-blind Armadillo, from my understanding, is not fully rolled out yet. So tell me where you are, what is available today, and what your roadmap looks like. And do you have any other interesting, cool features that you're hoping to add to the system?
I wish that I could start dropping all the different things that we're talking about doing in the future. But one thing is, I have experienced this in the past, especially with Calyx OS. Like, if you hint that you might be doing X, Y, or Z, then you get people coming to you all the time, like, "Are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet?" And it's like that scene from The Simpsons with Bart and Lisa just asking, "Are we there yet?" And so I don't want to drop too many things, but as far as double-blind Armadillo, well, I did mention earlier that we're trying to do some form of verifiable proof that people can look at. And then I think that there are some other use cases that we might, I think it's I'll just put it this way. I think there's an interesting question of, like, we've built this system using zero knowledge proofs and this mixed service to obfuscate, to separate, metadata from identity. And I think that there are other use cases that are really closely adjacent to being a mobile provider or a phone company, or phone handset company, that this technology maybe could easily transfer to. And so I guess that's as far as I want to go. I don't want to name what the things are, but you can let your imagination run wild.
All right, Nick. Well, that was great. That was very, very interesting. And I wish you all the luck, because as far as I know, this is the first service that's trying to do what you're trying to do. And I really look forward to seeing what you guys do. So thanks again for coming on the show and telling us all about it.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate you having me on today, and take care.
That was a really interesting interview. Thanks for hanging in. I know some of that was a little bit of technical. But that is just really interesting, and I'm so glad to see somebody trying to do this. I am never going to fault somebody for trying to bring us a more private service, and hopefully it will inspire others. Hopefully Nick will learn a lot along the way and improve things as it goes. I mean, this just started, so I'm very interested to see where he takes this, and I'm looking to try it myself, at least for a little while. I've got some other projects going on. I have to figure out the cell phone situation, blah, blah, blah. But hopefully when I get around to doing that, I will come back and give you a little report on how that went. But you could try it yourself. The pricing plans are very reasonable. Certainly given the privacy that you're getting, I think that's a nice trade-off. So check it out, Phreeli.com. It's in the show notes. And I also put other things there as well, including their white paper on double-blind armadillo. It's not that long, and it's easy enough to read if you're curious about more details there. Now, I also know that Nick said he wasn't supposed to tell you who his base carrier is, but I'm sure some of you are curious, and it's not really a secret. Just read a Wired article, and in the Wired article, it claimed that it was T-Mobile. Now, I don't know if it is or isn't, but that's what Wired says. So if that matters to you, that is the base upstream carrier that he is being an MVNO of. And I put a link to that article in the show notes as well. All right, so I've got a couple other interesting little tidbits to tease out of this. So first of all, Nick was talking about payphones, which, if you're of a certain age, you know payphones. And if you're not, like my daughters, they've probably never seen one in person. That's probably not true. They're probably old enough to have seen one. Maybe they didn't know what they were. But he was talking about dropping a dime in the payphone, because way back when, and I'm old enough to remember this too, that's what it would cost to make a local call. But you just had to put a dime in. It eventually went to a quarter, but I was just wondering how many of the young folks out there might not realize that that's where the phrase drop a dime on someone came from, as in call the police from a payphone so they wouldn't know who was calling, and that call would cost you a dime. And then I couldn't help but thinking, of course, the song Operator by Jim Croce, where he says, and you could keep the dime. That's what he's talking about. So Nick also mentioned 2600 Magazine. I've mentioned them before, but it's been a while since we've done a good hacker-oriented interview, and I probably should find a way to fix that sometime soon. I really would love to interview Emmanuel Goldstein at some point. But it's one of the original hacking zines from back in the 80s. It is still going today. You can go right now and check it out at 2600.com. That's 2600.com. And also, I did a little digging on this. I'm not sure. It's kind of hard to pin down, but I was curious how many people might be in a zip plus 4 area in the United States. And I think it really does vary. It's certainly just like the geography varies. If it's rural versus, a very crowded city like downtown Manhattan, the actual size of a zip plus 4 is going to be very different. But the amount of people could be, anywhere from dozens to hundreds, it seems, from my research, but it's still pretty vague. But I thought one of the real key takeaways from this is that we really need to realize that a lot of the reasons we end up having to turn over our personal information is for billing or tax purposes. The service itself can be pseudonymous. They might have some alias for us, but they don't need to know who we are, where we live, or anything else. But as soon as money gets involved, that's when, the knowledge has to come in. But Phreeli has figured out a very interesting way to keep those two things separate. Now, of course, like at Phreeli, that kind of means that since you don't know who the person is, you can't really trust them. You can't float them some money. You can't collect after the fact. So that does kind of lead to prepay models, but I'm okay with that. If that means them not having any information about who I am, fantastic. But even just using something like Apple Pay instead of a credit card prevents the merchant from learning a lot about you and tracking your purchases, which is the whole point, honestly, of things like Apple Pay. It's more secure and more private. Now, of course, the credit card, whatever credit card is backing your Apple Pay, that credit card company still sees your purchases. But the merchant, at least, is cut out. They don't need to know anything. As long as they're getting paid, they don't need to know anything about you. So anyway, my point here being is some of the takeaways from today's episode is if we can find clever ways to do things differently that aren't really that inconvenient, and honestly, in many cases, it's no different whatsoever in terms of convenience. We just do things differently, and we do it this way we don't need to gather information. What a concept. Okay, so for the patrons on Thursday, we get some bonus Q&A with Nick, and there's quite a lot, actually. It's probably another half hour's worth of content. We really kind of got off on some tangents, but I talk about trust and how we engender trust and what that really means. And is it a binary thing or is it a spectrum? We talk a little bit about the notion of a baseband processor in cell phones. That's a very technical aspect, but whether you realize this or not, your phone actually has 2 computer processors in it. It's almost like 2 computers in one. There's the one that you buy that you know of, and you get all the specs and, the A chips from Apple with all the stuff, and the Sea Dragon chips or whatever. Anyway, the chip you hear about. But embedded in that phone is a broadband modem, which is really, it's almost entire own separate system. And some attacks go against that processor. And we don't talk about that very often. But anyway, so I asked him a little bit about that, because Apple's now starting to make their own baseband chips. And that, I think, has some good privacy implications. We talk about why cell phones haven't gone to pure packet data. Why can't we just digitize everything like we kind of did with landline calls before no one had landlines anymore? Why do we need this kind of old, clunky, not terribly secure voice channel network when we could just do everything as packet data, and then we could have end-to-end encryption for all that? And then we really kind of go off in the weeds of talking about hacker culture and various famous hacker folks from way back. So all that will be coming on Thursday to the patrons as usual. Next week, we will have a news show as usual, and then we're going to have a really interesting interview with Eric Gardner from More Perfect Union and Justin Brookman from Consumer Reports. They did a really interesting and kind of a mind-blowing study about surveillance pricing and how different people, all in the same room at the same time buying the exact same products, were charged different amounts. Then we're going to be talking with Nate and Jonah from Privacy Guides. That's going to be a lot of fun. Then we're going to talk about online identity resolution, which is basically how they fingerprint and track you and figure out who you are. That'll be a panel discussion with some 3 great people. And yes, then we're going to get to Carissa Belize talking about her new book, Prophecy, and Cindy Cohen from EFF on her new book and her amazing career at the EFF and being a digital rights defender. And then plenty more on the book. So if you haven't already, subscribe, and then you won't miss any of that. All right, that's going to do it for this week. Take care, everybody. Stay safe out there. And until next time, as always, don't get caught with your drawbridge down.